Barbara McClintock, the woman who discovered jumping genes. In the 1940s and 1950s, while studying corn, scientist Barbara McClintock made a discovery that challenged everything biologists believed at the time. Back then, it was thought that genes in DNA were fixed in place like an unchanging blueprint. But McClintock found something completely unexpected. Some genes could actually move from one part of the genome to another. She called these sections controlling elements, which we now refer to as transposons or jumping genes. These mobile pieces of DNA could activate or deactivate other genes, helping to explain why certain plants like corn sometimes show unpredictable color patterns. More importantly, her work introduced the idea that gene regulation, turning genes on or off, is a real and powerful biological process. Today, gene regulation is known to be essential for how cells work, how organisms grow and develop, and even how diseases like cancer begin. But when McClintock first shared her results, most of the scientific community rejected them. The concept of genes moving around was just too strange for many to accept. Some even claimed she misunderstood her own data. Discouraged by this response, McClintock stopped publishing her work on the topic in 1953. Although she continued her research quietly, her discoveries went mostly unnoticed for over a decade. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when scientists began finding similar mobile DNA elements in bacteria, yeast, and viruses that her research was finally validated. With the help of modern molecular tools, researchers confirmed what McClintock had seen years earlier. Her work was suddenly recognized as groundbreaking. Barbara McClintock's discovery of jumping genes changed the way we understand genetics, showing that DNA is not as fixed as once believed, and opening the door to entirely new areas of genetic research. Robert Goddard, often called one of the pioneers of modern rocketry, was among the first to suggest that rockets could reach incredible heights and even travel into outer space. His idea was based on a simple principle. When a rocket expels hot gases at high speed from its engine, those gases push the rocket forward. One of his most important insights was that rockets do not need air to push against, meaning they could work just as well in the emptiness of space. To test this, Goddard carried out experiments in a vacuum and discovered that rockets actually perform better without the resistance of air. Despite his groundbreaking work, he was often dismissed and even ridiculed. He struggled to gain funding or recognition, and many scientists at the time thought rocket studies were unworthy of a serious physicist. Newspapers also mocked his ideas. A well-known example came from the New York Times on January 13, 1920. The paper claimed that Goddard lacked basic knowledge, wrongly insisting that rockets needed air to push against in order to move. This criticism deeply affected him, making him more private with his research. Years later, however, his theories were proven correct, though most of the credit only came after his death in 1945. One of the most notable acknowledgments arrived on July 17, 1969, the day after Apollo 11 was launched toward the moon. On that day, the New York Times issued a correction, admitting that rockets can indeed operate in both space and atmosphere. The paper concluded, "The Times regrets the era." Before William Harvey, most people still followed the teachings of the ancient Greek physician Galen. Galen had taught that the liver created blood from digested food and sent it throughout the body by way of the heart. His explanations, though already more than 500 years old, were still being taught in European medical schools. According to Galen's model, blood somehow passed from one side of the heart to the other through unseen holes, and the lungs were thought to cool the blood rather than supply it with air. In 1628, Harvey challenged this view by publishing his book De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart and blood. In it, he demonstrated that the heart is actually a pump, sending blood out through the arteries and receiving it back through the veins, forming a continuous circuit. He reached this conclusion through direct observation of living animals and carefully designed experiments. For instance, he calculated that, if Galen were correct, the liver would have to produce an impossibly large volume of blood every single day. Most physicians, however, rejected Harvey's discoveries. Many clung to Galen's authority, with one even declaring it was better to be wrong with Galen than right with Harvey. Because of such resistance, Harvey lost patience and much of his professional standing. Later in life, disheartened by criticism, he became more withdrawn and avoided heated debates, saying he preferred quiet wisdom over another storm of opposition. It took roughly 20 years before his theory of blood circulation gained wide acceptance. Louis Pasteur introduced the idea that tiny living organisms, which we now call microbes, were behind food spoilage and many illnesses. He also suggested that these microbes could be weakened or destroyed to protect people from disease. At the time, most scientists believed that processes like fermentation, for example, turning grape juice into wine, were purely chemical reactions, not the result of living organisms. When Pasteur argued that yeast, a living microbe, was responsible, many experts mocked him. French newspapers even published cartoons joking about yeast polluting wine. Despite the criticism, Pasteur continued experimenting. He showed that heating liquids could kill harmful microbes, a technique that became known as pasteurization. He also disproved the long-held belief in spontaneous generation, the idea that life could emerge from non-living matter by demonstrating that germs come from the air. Some critics accused him of poor science or even dishonesty. But as his results kept being confirmed, more people accepted his germ theory of disease. Pasteur's discoveries transformed medicine. His work led to sterilizing surgical tools and washing hands to prevent infection, and he developed vaccines that protected against diseases like anthrax and rabies. He even rescued the French silk industry by identifying and stopping infections in silkworms. Although he faced criticism and sometimes failed to credit others, his contributions reshaped science and medicine on a global scale. Marcello Malpighi, an Italian scientist of the 1600s, often called the father of microscopic anatomy, studied at the University of Bologna. Because he was not a native of Bologna, the university leadership held strong prejudice against him, a hostility that would follow him for much of his life and eventually lead to serious troubles. With the help of microscopes, Malpighi made groundbreaking discoveries that transformed biology. He was the first to observe capillaries, the tiny vessels linking arteries to veins, which provided crucial proof of how blood circulates in the body. He also identified red blood cells, examined the structure of the lungs and brain, discovered taste buds, and revealed that insects breathe through openings in their outer body rather than with lungs. While his work was respected in many places, including recognition from the Royal Society of London, which made him a member, he faced constant hostility in Bologna. Local scholars mocked and excluded him, and the tension eventually turned violent. His home was attacked and burned, his microscopes smashed, and his writings destroyed. Despite these setbacks, Malpighi persevered. He held teaching positions across Italy, served as physician to the Pope in Rome, and after his death, the Royal Society published his complete works, ensuring his legacy in science. In the 1950s, Robert Hanbury Brown and his collaborator Richard Twiss introduced an idea that challenged the way scientists thought about light. They suggested that the size of distant stars could be measured by studying how pairs of photons, the particles of light, showed statistical correlations with each other. This idea, known as the Hanbury-Brown-Twiss effect, implied that photons, usually considered independent, could behave in a connected way when observed under the right conditions. The proposal went against mainstream thinking. The renowned physicist Paul Dirac dismissed it outright, insisting that two photons could never interfere. Many others in the physics community agreed, calling the idea nonsense. To defend their work, Hanbury Brown published 3 detailed papers explaining how the effect could be observed with the technology of the time. Rather than waiting for acceptance, he and Twiss built their own radio telescope system and successfully measured the diameters of several bright stars, proving their method worked. Even with this evidence, skepticism remained. Critics argued that if the effect were genuine, it should also appear in laboratory tests with artificial light. Early attempts to replicate it failed, fueling doubts. Hanbury Brown, however, persisted. He repeated the experiment under carefully controlled lab conditions using visible light, and this time, the effect appeared exactly as predicted. This decisive demonstration ended the debate. Over the years, the Hanbury-Brown-Twiss effect became a cornerstone technique in optics, astronomy, and nuclear physics. Yet, despite the impact of his discovery, Hanbury Brown was never awarded a Nobel Prize. In the 19th century, scientists still lacked a clear understanding of heat, energy, and the behavior of matter, since the laws of thermodynamics were not yet fully developed and the existence of atoms and molecules had not been firmly proven. Although some thinkers suggested that atoms might exist, there was little evidence. Ludwig Boltzmann, however, based his work on the assumption that atoms and molecules were real. From this, he developed a new equation describing entropy, the measure of disorder, in a system which explained why natural processes tend to move from order to disorder. His ideas met fierce resistance. Influential scientists like Ernst Mach and Wilhelm Ostwald rejected his theories, insisting that physics should rely only on observable facts, not on invisible, unproven particles. Some journals even forced him to label atoms as useful fictions whenever he wrote about them. The opposition led to years of bitter debate, and Boltzmann spent much of his life defending his theories. In 1906, exhausted and isolated, he took his own life. Ironically, just a few years later, work by Albert Einstein and Jean Perrin provided undeniable proof of atoms and molecules, confirming Boltzmann's insights. Today, his ideas form the foundation of modern physics, chemistry, and biology, shaping our understanding of everything from the behavior of gases to the principles that power computers. His famous entropy equation is even inscribed on his tombstone in Vienna, a lasting reminder of his contributions to science. Georges Lemaitre challenged the widely accepted belief of his time that the universe was eternal and unchanging. He proposed instead that the universe was expanding. Using Einstein's general theory of relativity, he connected the observed motion of galaxies moving away from Earth to this expansion. In 1927, he even calculated an estimate for the rate of expansion, what we now call the Hubble constant. A few years later, in 1931, he introduced the concept of the primeval atom, the idea that the universe began from a single point. This would later become known as the Big Bang theory. Initially, Lemaitre's ideas were met with skepticism or outright ridicule. One major reason was that he was also a Catholic priest, which led many to suspect that his scientific theories were influenced by his religious views on creation. Even Einstein, while acknowledging his mathematics was correct, dismissed his physics as abominable. In 1929, however, Edwin Hubble published observations confirming that galaxies were indeed moving away from one another, exactly as Lemaitre had predicted 2 years earlier. Over time, scientists came to recognize that Lemaitre's theory was correct. By the 1960s, the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation provided strong evidence for the Big Bang model. Lemaitre lived just long enough to hear of this discovery before his death in 1966. Decades later, in 2018, his contributions were formally honored when Hubble's law was renamed the Hubble-Lemaitre law. These were the scientists whose ideas were once mocked, but time proved that they were right. Their journeys teach us that truth, even if delayed, always finds recognition. Which of these stories did you find the most inspiring? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating stories.